And so by 1776, this country created itself as a constitution, created a constitution saying that it would no longer pay taxes to the crown, no taxation without representation, all these nice little ideals that we talked about. But the bottom line was, there was so much money being made in America by this time with all the slaves that were here. You know, it was like, we're not going to pay you any more of this money. We're making this money ourselves. We enslaved these people. We went to Africa and set up this slave trade. We've been bringing these people. We brought them under our thing. We've got big time cotton in the state of Georgia. Cotton is king in the state of Georgia. Georgia reached a point by the 1800s that it was the largest producer of cotton in the world. South Carolina, the largest producer of rice in the world, thanks to slave production. And so we said, in this country, we're not going to be giving any more money to the crown. We are now independent. And so all the slave-holding, land-holding, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men who signed on to the Declaration said, we have a gentleman's agreement. Among us, we're all equal. And we will not even... But now there's something about the African, these slaves, we've got to make note of, because we have a reason for this. We're going to say that every person counts in the population count in this new country, and the black will be 3/5 of a man. Now, a lot of black people are upset about this, because we think that we're only being counted as 3/5 of a man. But in fact, we were no fifths of a man, because really we didn't have any rights or privileges or anything else, not even as slaves. You know, in some slave institutions, you could get married or something like this, or you could at least have your own religion, or you could speak your own language, or you could, you know, you had little slave days at the market or something like this. But in America, when you were a slave in America, you didn't exist as a human being. You were absolutely absent. Your humanity was absolutely destroyed. You couldn't get married. You know, when people talk about the breakdown of the black family, I remind them about the prohibition against marriage in the slave institution in America. But in any case, the black was identified as 3/5 of a man, and that was very convenient for whites who owned slaves or in the slaveholding states, as opposed to the northern states where they like to tell you they abolished slavery early, although they profited so much from slavery, what did it matter to them? By 1781-82, Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson, of course, the architect of the Declaration of Independence, and certainly who set the tone for the culture and nature and the principles on which this country was founded. And a lot of people like to tell you, know, Jefferson was really, you know, come on. Yeah, he was a slaveholder, and yeah, he owned his kids and, you know, all that sort of thing. But, you know, he was a man of his time, and wasn't he a great writer? And, you know, it'd be like telling a Jew that, well, Goebbels, you know, okay, he was a Nazi, but he wrote great stuff for Hitler, and he was a brilliant, he could write a beautiful book here or there. How insulting can you be? For me, to tell me that Thomas Jefferson, other than the detail that he happened to be the biggest slaveholder of his time, is just, he was a man of his time. Let's get over it, and let's just realize that Thomas Jefferson really, in fact, was a great man. And what is it that Jefferson actually said? Other than the Declaration of Independence that was attributed to him, Thomas Jefferson, of course, wrote one book, and that was called Notes on the State of Virginia. And I assume that everybody here has heard of the Notes on the State of Virginia, but probably not, because it doesn't get into the text of our elementary, junior high, or high schools, and most of the time not even our colleges. So one of the things that Jefferson says in Notes is that the blacks, and he writes this for the French really, because he was a Francophile, so he wrote notes for the French, and he said, and the French were asking, you know, why aren't you now going to bring the blacks into this new experiment where all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? And Jefferson says, well, there are reasons why the blacks cannot be incorporated, and those reasons have to do with the differences which are physical and moral as well as political. And I'll just read you a very brief excerpt from the Notes on the State of Virginia. He says one of the differences is the difference of color, is the color of the black, the color of blood or bile, but in any case it's fixed in nature. And he asserts that the fine mixtures of red and white are preferable to that eternal monotony, that immovable veil of black. He said blacks have a very strong and disagreeable odor. They are lazy. They have a disposition to sleep. He could not find a black that uttered a thought above plain narration, and could not find a black that had even an elementary trait of painting or sculpture. The only time there was any improvement seen in the black was in the first instance of their mixture with whites. That nature had produced this distinction, and that, he says, I advance it, therefore, that the blacks are inferior to the whites in the endowments of both body and mind. Now, isn't that just incredible? I mean, if somebody wrote that today, wouldn't you just want to slap him silly? And yet we celebrate Jefferson. He was Clinton's hero, and certainly many, many other presidents' heroes. In 1800, of course, Jefferson himself became president. And how did he become president? Sort of the way George Bush became president. That is to say, he wasn't exactly elected. Aaron Burr, in fact, won that election, didn't he? And when Aaron Burr won that election, how did Jefferson manage to be? Well, this was the first time this all went to the Congress. And what did the Congress say? Well, wait a minute. Now, we have to look at the count and the number of electoral votes in the Electoral College that nobody ever understands. But at the end of the day, Jefferson ends up winning because the slave states that voted for him counted those 3/5 of a man. So if you had 5 white men in Pennsylvania and you had 5 white men who owned slaves in Virginia, then you had 5 plus 100 of 3/5 of 100 people. So you win the election. And that is how Jefferson, of course, became president of the United States, very much like George Bush. And by 1829, 1837 to 1837, when Andrew Jackson was president, we now knew what America was because Jackson told us. He said that America was a state-centric, commercial, white republic based on white supremacy, its purpose being, quote, the advancement of a Protestant Anglo-American civilization. The word civilization being amazingly used by Andrew Jackson. By 1863, of course, we have the Emancipation Proclamation, and all of this time, of course, the black is a slave, and the justification for slavery is the inherent inferiority of the black, and the fact that this is going to be a white civilization, and that the labor pool will just happen to be black, free black labor that doesn't count because these are not 3/5 of a man, but not really a human being. In the Emancipation Proclamation, of course, Lincoln talks about the abolition of slavery, and everybody's like, whoa, Lincoln, we're so happy. Master Lincoln done freed the slaves, but in fact, Master Lincoln was prepared only to free the slaves in the seceding states, which he very specifically says, so there's nothing secretive about this, and it's certainly not a conspiracy theorist notion, it's just what he said. And in addition to that, Lincoln said, and I quote, there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race, unquote. So, but in any case, the South loses the war because the slaves actually did believe they might be free and decided to drop their buckets where they were and not work for the South anymore. And the tide of war shifted. The Northern industrialists won, and in 1865 the Union was saved, except for black people. And of course, General Sherman issues Field Order number 15 and says, we've got to give these people some kind of way to start a life. Not start over because they haven't existed for 250 years as slaves, so we're going to give them 40 acres per slave family. And a lot of slaves actually heard about this and actually seized some lands. Some of them are still living on them in the Carolinas. The Gullah Geechees are still holding on to their 40 acres from the Field Order number 15, but the majority of us were rooted out of our notions of ever having any stake in America in any meaningful and a lasting way. At the same time, of course, 1865, before the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery was ratified, we had two great things to occur. One was the rise of the white terrorist organizations like the KKK, and at the same time, the institutionalization or the institution of the so-called black codes, in which blacks went from being slaves to being criminals. Yes, and so we went from saying everybody black just about. These codes were directed at black behavior, and for any failure of behavior, you could be arrested, mostly for being a vagrant. And what did that do? Well, that built up a criminal population of blacks. And what did they do? Well, they built the railroads here in Georgia, for example. That was one thing. And the old chain gang and all of that. And so you had a large black criminal population coming out of the 1865 Emancipation Proclamation, or the emancipation or the abolition of slavery. And this went on until we finally had what we now know as the beginning of American apartheid in 1896 under Plessy. Remember Plessy? Homer Plessy was a light-skinned Negro who probably thought he was white. Matter of fact, we know he thought he was white because he actually says so. And Plessy went to sit on a train with white people in the state of Louisiana, and they said, Plessy, you know, you're going to have to get back with the black people because the Louisiana law is that we have segregated trains. And Plessy said, well, I'm not really black. I'm an octoroon, you know. I only have 1/8 black blood, and we know that Thomas Jefferson talks about that mixture of white blood. It must make you better and better. And so he has only got 1/8 black blood now, and they said, no, Plessy, you look like you deserve to be back there with the rest of them, so go on back there, okay? And Plessy was quite shocked, but shocked enough to get enough money together to go to the Supreme Court. And his first argument, of course, was that he really wasn't black because he was 1/8 white. But if he were black, which he wasn't, but if he had been black, that as a black he was now free, and that his civil rights and the rights under the law made him so that he ought to be able to sit with whites in any car. And the court said, you know, we cannot legislate. We cannot rule on social construction. We can't civilize this society by the law. This has to happen naturally or somewhat. We're not going to make white people have to sit next to black people. As long as the accommodations are equal, they can be separate. We uphold the Louisiana law, and we institute American apartheid. Now, why is this significant? What difference does it make if the races are segregated? Well, it makes a lot of difference if you don't have a train. You know what I mean? If you need to get on the train and it's not your train, and you have to keep on asking for equal accommodations, and I don't feel like giving them to you, well, you'll be just going to court every year. Well, as a matter of fact, we did, didn't we? We went to court every year that you can think of over this or that, trying to figure out how we were going to get around Plessy, the KKK, and all of the rest of it. And so we developed a freedom struggle. And that freedom struggle, we had Booker T. Washington. A lot of people revisit Booker T. Washington in different ways and say, well, you know, he was talking about he didn't want to integrate, 5 fingers on the hand, the Atlanta, you know, Cotton Exposition speech and so forth and so on. But Booker T. Washington said, look, we're not trying to marry your daughters, okay? But we do need some money. And so if you would just go ahead and give us some money, we will be quiet and go and do what we need to do and have an independent economy separate from yours, because you really can't make it without us, and we know we can't make it without you. And Du Bois comes along and talks about, by the turn of the century, the 20th century, into the 20th century, talks about, with the Niagara movement, the whole question of becoming citizens of America, becoming better. He talks about the talented 10th, of course, he renounces that, but we find we're looking for ways to be free in America, okay? And we have, of course, Marcus Garvey really admiring Booker T. Washington, but talking about independence and economic independence, talking about, as a matter of fact, let's just leave. Let's just leave. Couldn't even leave. Didn't even want us to leave. Can't stay, can't leave. Marcus Garvey's taken down by little J. Edgar Hoover, who becomes so important to the rest of our freedom struggle. We have people trying to form workers' unions, trying to get into unions, trying to get work. Don't buy where you can't work. Forming unions, the first union, of course, being the sleeping car porters, service unions, and so forth. We get into World War II, and we find we even have segregated troops. Can't even get a job to fight on the front lines, but expected to die on the front lines. And, of course, we have this moment when Truman says, we'll desegregate the army. Like, this is a wonderful moment in history. We can now equally fight and die alongside of whites. And even that was too much, because later on we find that we didn't do that. And finally, we come down to 1954 and the Brown decision, and little Linda Brown trying to go to school in Topeka, Kansas, and her father saying, wait a minute, Linda's got to go 4 miles down the road to this bad school, this ugly school, and right across the street here, or a mile or whatever it was away, is a beautiful school that is reserved for white children because it's more beautiful and it has more money in it, and we want her to go there. And the NAACP takes up this case, and the court says, in Brown says, we overturn Plessy as to public education. Now, I've talked to the head of one of the people of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and I've asked if Plessy has actually ever been completely overturned. And do you want to know the irony? That, well, it really hasn't exactly been overturned completely, just as to public education under Brown. And what do we have there? Of course, more bloodshed than we had seen in the Civil War almost. All over this country, the fear and the hatred has shown, people having to go to UGA, you know, with troops, and now we can't get in there anyway, so, you know, end of that conversation. By 1955, of course, we have the great moment when Rosa Parks, along with the NAACP there in Montgomery, said, we're going to desegregate this bus. And she says, I'm not going to get up and give my seat to a white person, even though the law requires me. And so here is Rosa Parks, all of these years later, still trying to get on the bus the way Plessy tried to get on a train. Can you imagine? Now, this is not owning anything, and so forth and so on. And of course, we have Dr. King coming into this moment, into the historical landscape, and making a mark and doing all of the things that we now know were done in terms of trying to desegregate of the Southern reality and to find access to the things that people needed by desegregation. And we have any number of other organizations beginning to form, and the Freedom Rides beginning to form, and finally we have the March on Washington, the great moral speech that Martin Luther King talks about when he talks about the dream. And then we finally go into 1965. We not only have the assassination of Malcolm X, coming out of the Nation of Islam, which really came out of Marcus Garvey and the ideals of black independence and economic independence, whatever people think about these individuals. And we have the uprisings beginning with the Watts, California uprising in 1965 and the Kerner Commission soon coming to be fun. What is wrong with black people? What is this black rage about? And finally saying that the black rage is about the fact that racism has produced ghettoization and has produced two Americas, one black, one white, separate and unequal. And in 1966, of course, the founding of the Black Panther Party, based on coming out of the call for black power, coming out of all of this moment, and we're still struggling to find freedom in America 100 years after the emancipation or the abolition of slavery, after the passage of the 13th Amendment, and we find the Black Panther Party fighting for human rights and international revolution. And by 1968, of course, nonviolence was indeed murdered brutally in Memphis, Tennessee, in the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Now, that's the arc of history in the freedom struggle of blacks. And we find that we're very much in the same place we were at that period there, and I mean that punctuation mark at the end of Dr. King's life as we were then, as we are today.